Settle in. Let your eyes rest. Tonight we drift back along a wide brown river, where the air is warm and smells faintly of river mud and baking bread. Back to a land the old ones simply called Kemet, the Black Land, for the dark, fertile soil the Nile left behind each year, and to distinguish it from the red, lifeless desert pressing in on either side. There is no need to remember dates tonight, or the names of kings carved into stone. We are not here for that. We are here only to watch, to listen, and to rest inside an ordinary day lived by ordinary people, beside the gentlest river the ancient world ever knew. Imagine, if you will, the first pale light touching the water. Fishermen already pushing their reed boats from the muddy bank. Herons lifting, unhurried, into a sky still holding a few fading stars. Somewhere behind the palm trees, mudbrick walls are warming in the early sun, and a whole world is quietly waking, just as it did some 4,000 years ago. Let your breathing slow now with the rivers. There is nowhere to be, nothing to do. Only this, a day in Kemet, the Black Land, unfolding gently around you. Let us begin where every Egyptian day began, with the river itself. Before there were temples, before there were pyramids, before there was even a single word of writing pressed into wet clay, there was the Nile. To the people who lived along its banks, the river was not simply water. It was breath and bread and time itself. Each year, with a patience the rest of the world has long forgotten how to imagine, the Nile rose, slowly, swelling beyond its banks in the late summer months, spreading a thin, dark silt across the fields on either side. The Egyptians called this gift Akhet, the inundation, and they did not fear it as a flood. They welcomed it as a blessing. Picture a farmer standing at the edge of his land in those quiet weeks before the rise, watching the horizon for the first telltale cloudiness in the water, far upstream where no Egyptian had ever travelled, in lands they only imagined as the dwelling place of the river's source. He could not have known of the rains falling on distant highlands far to the south. To him, the flood was simply a mercy, sent each year by unseen hands. When the waters finally came, they did not arrive as a wall, but as a slow, gentle swelling, rising a little more each night, until the fields that had baked hard and pale under the summer sun disappeared beneath a calm, brown sheet of water, dotted here and there with the tops of date palms and the rooftops of the highest village houses. Children would wade out along the new shorelines, laughing, catching small fish with their bare hands in water that had, only days before, been dry and cracked earth. For weeks, life slowed almost to a stop in the fields. There was no planting to be done while the water sat upon the land, only waiting. And so this season became, for many, a season of building. It was no accident, the old stories say, that the great stone monuments of Egypt rose largely in these quiet flood months, when farmers could not farm, but still needed bread for their families, and so came instead to work the quarries and haul the stones, paid in grain and beer for their labour. When at last the waters drew back, sliding gently downstream toward the sea, they left behind something almost unbelievable to anyone who has only known dry, exhausted soil. A fresh, dark, soft layer of the richest earth in the ancient world. The farmers called it simply the Black Land, and it was this colour, this dark and fertile gift, that gave all of Egypt its true name. Not gold, not the pale desert sand that tourists imagine even now. Black. The colour of life renewing itself, season after season, without fail. A man might walk out into his fields in those first days after the flood receded and press his bare foot into earth so soft, so dark, so full of promise, that he needed only scatter his seed by hand and walk his goats and sheep across it, their small hooves pressing the grain gently down into the welcoming soil. No plow was needed in those earliest days, and even later, when wooden plows were drawn by oxen, the work remained light compared to other lands, because the river had already done the hardest labour, quietly beneath the surface of the water, while the people slept. This was the rhythm beneath every other rhythm in Egypt. The flood, the planting, the long green growing months, the harvest, and then the slow waiting once again. Kings rose and fell. Temples were built and rebuilt. But the river simply continued, indifferent and generous in equal measure, asking nothing of the people who depended on it entirely, except that they notice and be grateful. And so, before the markets, before the workshops, before even the gods were given their first names, there was this one great certainty. The thing every child along the riverbank understood before they understood almost anything else. That life and the river were, in the end, the very same gentle, endless thing. Let us move now, gently, drifting from the wide fields toward the narrow lanes where the people of Kemet made their homes. Most homes in ancient Egypt were not grand at all, and there was a quiet wisdom in that. Imagine a narrow street in a village not far from the river, the houses pressed close together for shade, their walls made of simple mud brick, clay dug from the riverbank itself, mixed with straw, shaped in wooden moulds, and left to dry hard beneath the relentless sun. A family might make their own bricks for an addition to their home in only a few days, working together in the cool hours of early morning before the heat became too much to bear. Inside, the rooms were dim and cool, a welcome relief from the brightness outside. Windows were small and set high, near the ceiling, just large enough to let a little air circulate without letting in too much heat or dust. The floor beneath bare feet was simply packed earth, sometimes covered with woven reed mats, soft underfoot and easily rolled away when it was time to sweep the home clean. Most houses had a flat roof, and it was here, in the cool of the evening, that much of family life truly happened. Picture a mother climbing a simple ladder or narrow stairway in the fading light, carrying bread up to where her family already sits together. The heat of the day finally breaking, a faint breeze moving in off the river. Many families slept on their rooftops during the hottest months, beneath a blanket of stars so bright and so numerous that the old Egyptians wove entire stories of gods and souls into their patterns. A typical home held only a few rooms, perhaps an entry room near the street, used for receiving guests and for small household tasks. Then a central living space, often with a raised platform along one wall that served as a kind of low couch or bed. And finally, toward the back, a small kitchen area, sometimes open to the sky to let cooking smoke escape. Wealthier families might add bedrooms, storage rooms for grain and oil, even a small walled garden with a pool. But the bones of the home, simple, cool, made from the earth itself, remained much the same from the poorest farmer's hut to the comfortable house of a scribe. Furniture, too, was simple and practical. A few low stools, carved from local wood, a wooden chest or two for linens and valuables, pottery jars, tall and curved, standing in cool corners to keep water, beer, and grain fresh in the heat. The wealthy might have a proper bed frame, raised on short legs to keep sleeping bodies away from scorpions and crawling things, with a curved wooden headrest in place of a soft pillow. Strange to imagine now, but Egyptians swore by its coolness against the back of the neck on a hot night. Walls inside the home were often whitewashed with a thin plaster, and in homes that could afford it, painted with simple, cheerful patterns. Lotus flowers, small birds, bands of colour framing a doorway. There was no sense in an Egyptian home that beauty belonged only to temples and tombs. Even a humble house deserved a little colour, a little life, a little softness against the bare practicality of mud brick walls. And always, somewhere near the entrance or in a small household shrine, a niche for the family's protective gods. Bess, perhaps, the small, fierce-faced guardian of home and childbirth, or Taweret, gentle protector of mothers, her hippopotamus form somehow more comforting than strange. Small offerings of bread or flowers might rest before these niches, renewed quietly, day after day, by whoever in the household remembered first. As evening settled fully over the village, lamps would be lit, simple clay bowls holding oil and a twisted linen wick, casting a small, warm, flickering light across the room, very much like the candlelight that gathers around you now. In that soft glow, the family gathered, the work of the day finally behind them, and the home, built from nothing more than river clay and sunlight, patience and care, became, for a few quiet hours, the whole of their world. Let us move now, gently, out from the home and into the fields and workshops where the people of Kemet spent their working hours. When the sun rose fully over the fields, the real work of the day began, and it began early, before the heat could grow unbearable. For most families along the Nile, that work was farming, and it followed the river's calendar far more closely than any calendar of kings. Picture a man walking steadily across his land in the cool of early morning, a leather pouch of barley slung across his shoulder, scattering seed with a slow, practiced motion, his arm rising and falling in a rhythm so old it seemed to belong to the land itself rather than to him. Behind him, a few goats picked their way across the freshly sown earth, their small hooves pressing the seed gently down into soil still dark and soft from the flood. He would pause now and then, simply to feel the morning air on his skin while it was still cool, to watch the light change colour over the water in the distance, and then return to his work, unhurried, knowing the river had already done the hardest part of this labour for him, quietly, beneath the surface, while he slept. Not far away, in the shade of a low mud brick wall, a potter sat at his simple wheel, turning it slowly with one foot while his hands cradled a mound of wet river clay between them. Watch how the clay rises under his palms, how it wobbles, then steadies, then climbs into the curved shape of a water jar, his fingers reading the clay the way another man might read the sky. He worked in silence mostly, The only sounds, the soft creak of the spinning wheel and the occasional low hum of a tune he barely seemed aware he was singing. There was no rush in him. A jar shaped too quickly cracked in the kiln, so he let his hands move only as fast as the clay allowed. A little further along, beneath an awning stretched for shade, a weaver sat cross-legged before a loom laid flat and low across the ground, her fingers moving thread the colour of pale flax in a rhythm so practiced it seemed almost like breathing. In and out. The shuttle passing back and forth, the cloth growing, thread by thread, beneath her steady hands. She might work like this for the better part of a morning, pausing only to ease the ache from her shoulders, or to share a quiet word with a neighbour weaving beside her. The two of them content simply to sit together in the shade, hands busy, voices soft. And in a cooler room near the temple, a young scribe sat with a wooden pallet resting across his knees, a reed pen balanced lightly in his fingers, his eyes moving slowly across a line of hieroglyphic signs he was learning, very carefully, to copy. Each sign demanded patience, a bird's wing curved just so, a coil of rope traced without a tremor. He had been at this practice for years already, and would continue for years more, before his hand could be trusted with anything that truly mattered. A temple's grain count, a prayer meant to outlast the stone it was carved upon. For now, he simply practiced, sign after careful sign, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the quiet room. By the time the sun reached its highest, most punishing point, all of this slowed. The farmer found shade beneath a palm. The potter set down his wet clay before it could dry wrong in the heat. The weaver rested her shoulders. The scribe set his pen aside and closed his tired eyes for a moment. And for an hour or two, in fields and workshops alike, all of Kemet simply rested together, waiting for the worst of the heat to pass. Let us move now, gently, to a different kind of gathering, to the markets and lanes where the people of Kemet exchanged not just goods, but conversation, news, and the small comforts of daily life. There was no money in ancient Egypt, not for most of its long history, and yet the markets along the riverbank were never quiet. Imagine a wide, dusty space near the river landing, where boats arrived each morning carrying grain, pottery, fish, and cloth from villages up and down the Nile. Here, under simple woven awnings stretched for shade, traders laid out their goods on mats spread across the ground, and the business of the day became, in its essence, a long, unhurried conversation of bartering. A woman might arrive with a basket of fresh bread and a jar of beer she had brewed herself, hoping to trade them for a length of linen cloth or a handful of dried fish. Value in this world was measured in a unit called the deben, not a coin you could hold, but a kind of shared understanding, a weight of copper or silver against which the worth of bread, beer, sandals, or cloth could be quietly calculated in the mind, even when no metal changed hands at all. A goat might be worth so many deben, a fine wooden chair considerably more. And so two neighbours could agree, without argument, that a basket of onions was a fair trade for a new pair of woven sandals, each silently converting the goods into the same invisible measure. Up and down the lanes, the sounds and smells of the market mingled gently, the yeasty warmth of fresh bread, the sharp tang of dried fish laid out on mats, the perfume of lotus oil sold in small clay jars, the low murmur of bargaining voices, punctuated now and then by laughter or the call of a vendor naming his price for a particularly fine piece of pottery. Children wove between the stalls, sometimes sent on errands by their mothers, sometimes simply drawn by curiosity to watch a craftsman demonstrate a new tool or a travelling storyteller gather a small crowd in the shade. Beyond the local market, larger networks of trade connected Egypt to a wider world few villagers ever saw with their own eyes. Boats travelled north along the Nile, carrying grain toward the great cities near the delta, and south toward Nubia, returning laden with gold, ebony wood, ivory, and the skins of animals unknown along the river's middle stretches. From the east, across desert routes walked by donkey caravans, came incense, fine stones, and copper. From across the Great Sea to the north came cedar wood from distant Lebanon, prized above all else for boat building and fine furniture, since trees along the Nile itself grew too soft and too few. A merchant returning from such a journey might be greeted almost like a storyteller himself, neighbours gathering to hear of the strange customs and stranger landscapes he had witnessed, the goods he carried serving as proof of tales that might otherwise seem like fancy. In this way, the marketplace was never simply about goods changing hands. It was the village's window onto the wider world, its gathering place for news, for gossip, for the small dramas and quiet joys of daily life. Toward the edges of the market, scribes sometimes sat with their writing palettes, available to draft a letter, record a transaction, or settle a dispute between traders who could not agree on a fair exchange, their neat columns of hieroglyphic signs lending a quiet authority to whatever agreement was finally reached. And nearby, a baker might be selling loaves still warm from a clay oven, the bread itself often shaped into small, pleasing forms, animals or simple decorative twists, sold not only as food, but almost as a small daily pleasure. As the afternoon light grew long and golden, the market slowly emptied, traders packing away their mats and unsold goods, neighbours parting with promises to return tomorrow or the day after, whenever the boats came again from upriver. The dust settled, the voices faded, and the lane that had been, only hours before, the busiest place in the village, returned once more to quiet, waiting for another morning, another gathering, another small exchange of bread for cloth or gossip for grain. Let us move now gently toward the hearth, where the day's harvest and the market's bounty were finally transformed into the meal that brought every family together. If there was one taste that bound every Egyptian life together, rich or poor, it was the taste of bread, and alongside it, almost always, a cup of thick, mildly sweet beer. Picture a kitchen courtyard, open to the sky, where a woman kneels before a simple clay oven shaped like a tall, narrow dome. Inside it, a fire of dried dung and reeds burns low and steady, heating the clay walls until they glow faintly with warmth. She presses flat rounds of dough made from coarsely ground emmer wheat or barley against the oven's hot inner walls, where they bake quickly, the smell of warm bread drifting out across the courtyard and mingling with the cooking smoke that rises gently into the evening air. Bread in Kemet was not the soft, refined loaf we might imagine today. The grinding stones used to mill the grain left behind tiny fragments of grit, and over a lifetime, This gritty bread wore down the teeth of nearly everyone who ate it, a small, quiet price paid daily for survival along the river. And yet it was eaten with real pleasure, sometimes flavoured with dates or honey or seeds, shaped into rounds, ovals, even small animal forms for festivals and family celebrations. Beer, too, was less like the beer we know now and more like a thick, nourishing porridge made from fermented barley bread soaked in water and lightly sweetened, often with dates. It was safer to drink than river water alone, and it was consumed by everyone. Farmers in the field, children at the family table, even offered to the gods themselves in temple rituals. A worker's daily wages were often paid quite literally in bread and beer, a measure that tells us, more clearly than any text, just how central these two simple things were to ordinary Egyptian survival and comfort alike. Beyond bread and beer, the evening table, modest as it usually was, might hold a simple stew of lentils or beans, flavoured with onion, garlic, and a little salt. Families near the river ate fish often, caught fresh that same day, grilled over open coals, or dried in the sun for leaner months. Meat, by contrast, was a rarer pleasure, usually reserved for festivals, for the wealthy, or for offerings at the household shrine, since cattle, sheep, and goats represented real wealth, not to be slaughtered lightly. Vegetables grown in small garden plots near the home, onions, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, added freshness to the meal, along with fruit when it was in season. Sweet dates from the palms that lined every village lane, figs and the small, tart grapes that some families grew on simple wooden trellises near their courtyards, pressed occasionally into a light, treasured wine for special occasions. The family gathered for this evening meal not at a table in the way we might picture today, but often seated on low stools or simply on mats spread across the floor, sharing food from a few common bowls, eating with their fingers, scooping stew with torn pieces of bread. There was no rush to this meal. The work of the day was finished, the heat was finally breaking, and the meal became, as it has for families in every age, less about the food itself than about the simple, quiet pleasure of being together as darkness gathered gently outside. As the meal ended, small clay lamps were lit, their wicks soaked in oil, casting that same warm, flickering glow you might imagine gathered around you now. Conversations softened. A grandmother might begin a familiar story, half remembered, half invented anew each time she told it, about gods and floods and the strange, distant beginning of the world. And the family, full and unhurried, settled in to listen, the night outside deepening slowly over fields and river alike. Let us move now, gently, to the children of Kemet and to the small joys, lessons and games that filled their growing years. Children in ancient Egypt were, by all the old evidence, deeply loved, and largely allowed simply to be children, for as long as their families could afford to let them. Picture a group of them at the river's edge in the cool of early morning, barefoot, their short, simple linen tunics already damp from wading at the shallow water's rim. Most young children, in fact, wore very little at all in the warmest months, a practical comfort in such heat, and nothing thought shameful about it. They played much as children everywhere have always played, chasing one another along the bank, wrestling gently in soft sand, splashing handfuls of river water at each other while their mothers washed linen nearby, half watching, half lost in their own quiet conversation. Toys from this world have survived remarkably well in the dry desert air, and they tell their own gentle story. Small wooden animals with legs that moved on simple pegged joints, a crocodile whose jaw could snap open and closed, a lion that prowled forward when pulled along on a string, clay balls smoothed and painted, spinning tops, simple dolls made from wood or woven reeds dressed in scraps of linen, their painted faces worn soft and indistinct now from generations of small, careful hands. Board games, too, were a beloved pastime for children and adults alike. Imagine a family gathered in the cool of evening around a simple game called senet, played on a long board divided into 30 squares, moving pieces according to the throw of carved sticks or bones, the game stretching on companionably for an hour or more, laughter rising and falling with each unlucky throw. Some believed senet held a deeper meaning too, a journey through the dangers of the afterlife, but for a child, it was simply a delightful evening game, played again and again until the lamps burned low. Not all of childhood was play, of course. From quite a young age, children began to learn the skills their families needed. A farmer's son might follow his father into the fields almost as soon as he could walk steadily, learning to scare birds from the grain, then later to guide the oxen, then eventually to handle the plow himself. A craftsman's daughter might sit beside her mother at the loom, small fingers slowly learning the rhythm of the weave, or beside a potter's wheel, watching, copying, failing, and trying again. For a fortunate few, mostly the sons of officials, priests, and scribes, though occasionally daughters as well, formal schooling offered a different kind of childhood. Picture a small room attached to a temple where boys sat cross-legged on the floor, practicing hieroglyphic signs on broken pieces of pottery or flakes of limestone, far cheaper than the precious papyrus reserved for finished, important work. Discipline in these schools could be strict, and old texts record teachers' stern reminders that a boy's ear is on his back, and he learns best when it is beaten. Though we might gently hope, for the sake of the children of Kemet, that such words were spoken more often than carried out. Girls, more often than boys, remained at home, learning household management, weaving, brewing, and the careful arts of food preparation directly from their mothers and grandmothers. Practical, essential knowledge passed gently from hand to hand across generations, the same knowledge, in many ways, that had sustained Egyptian homes since long before any of them were born. And through it all, threading every stage of childhood, ran a quiet current of protection and tenderness. Amulets of Bes and Taweret were tied around infants' necks to ward off illness and harm. Mothers nursed their children for years, far longer than many cultures since, believing it kept them healthy and safe. And in the evenings, as the family gathered for the meal we have already imagined together, children fell asleep against their parents' shoulders, lulled by familiar voices and the low, steady hum of a household at rest, much as a listener might be drifting now, here, beside this same gentle river of story. Let us move now, gently, toward the end of the day, as the people of Kemet turned their thoughts upward, to the stars and to the quiet rest that awaited them. As night fell fully over the river, the household lamps were finally allowed to burn low and then go dark, one by one. Outside, the stars gathered in their old, familiar patterns, the same patterns the Egyptians wove into stories of gods crossing the sky each night in a boat much like the reed boats that still rested, quiet now, along the riverbank below. Families lay together on their cool rooftops or settled onto low beds inside, the day's heat finally surrendering to a gentle night breeze drifting in off the water. Tomorrow, the fields would need tending, or the market would open again, or a scribe's lessons would resume beneath the temple's cool shade. But for now, none of that mattered. There was only the river, moving softly in the darkness as it always had and always would, and the quiet, settled feeling of a long day's work finally, gently done. Sleep now, here, beside the candlelight, just as they did beside theirs.